Okay, why don't we get started, folks? So people will still trickle in, and thank you for joining us today. So this is an effort by the Archery Society, but more specifically by the new group that Lisa Hunter has led and is trying to formalize and sustain, which is a group that's dedicated to mentoring, but organized and maintained and sustained by students, postdocs, and PhDs in the field. So this is kind of like Arrow's Sparrow, except Lisa calls it SPAS, and I've forgotten what that stands for, SPAAS. But nonetheless, today we have 4 of the 5 panelists so far, and we're hoping Dave will jump on in just a second. And the slide you're seeing here is their words. I asked them for 6 words to describe their science and 6 words to describe their mentorship, their thoughts on mentorship. So what I would like to do is start by asking each panelist to introduce themselves and take a few seconds to tell us what they do. That would be the 6 words describing their science, and then then say a couple of words, if they would like to, about the 6 words that they have chosen to describe their take on mentorship. So with that, let us go from left to right on the screen. So Katie, you're first.
Great. Well, thank you, Sumit, for organizing this. I'm super excited to be here. The 6 words to describe your science gave me flashbacks of writing my F-32, like how much can I write in like this much space? So it's always fun. My name's Katie. I'm a PhD candidate at Vanderbilt. I also got my AUD at Vanderbilt just a few years ago. I work in Renee Gifford's lab, where we mostly work on improving outcomes for individuals with hearing loss, whether that be a hearing aid, bone anchored device, or cochlear implants. My research has mainly focused on measuring channel interaction in cochlear implants. So that's the substantial overlap and stimulation between neighboring electrodes. It's a huge problem. It contributes to poor spectral resolution and, of course, variable outcomes. And so we focus primarily on speech outcomes in our lab. And when I was thinking about writing an F-32, my passion at heart has always been music and music perception. How do we make it better for folks with hearing loss? So that was really what I was thinking about when I was thinking, what should I write my NRSA application on? And I really wrote it as an opportunity to get additional expertise in areas that weren't available to me here at Vanderbilt. So I asked Ray Goldsworthy, who is a very renowned expert on music perception and cochlear implants, to be a co-sponsor on my grant. And I really thought of it as sort of an opportunity to come up with a wish list of things that I feel like I still don't really have a good grasp on or want to learn more about. And so that's sort of the areas that I wrote about in my training plan for the F-32. Just a quick note about some of those, so like, I felt like I wanted to learn more about MATLAB coding skills. I wanted to learn more about open science practices. And I also wanted to learn more about like the neurobiology of hearing loss. That's something that I didn't really focus on in my PhD coursework. So I'll leave it there for now. And if anybody has questions further, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Katie. Okay, so Dave's not here yet. So next, Courtney, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Glavin, and I was telling Ed earlier that I think Sumit felt obligated to invite me to this because I am one of his PhD students. I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern in my 4th year, and as my science statement says, my work is evaluating cochlear aging using otoacoustic emissions, or OAEs. So I'm specifically interested in early signs of aging and how we can detect aging earlier in life. So think in your 30s or your 40s, well before people traditionally notice signs of hearing loss, and doing that using OAEs. I think it might say a little bit about me that I use 7 words instead of 6 in my statement about my NRSA. But I tried to get away with it by using a /. But essentially, I see the NRSA as time and resources to help develop your science. Like Katie, I did an AUD at Northwestern before returning for my PhD, and actually in between those two paths, I worked in industry at a hearing aid manufacturer for 5 years. And I loved working clinically. I loved working in industry. I thought I learned so much. But one of the biggest lessons I learned was that the time and resources to learn something new and to develop your skills, that's a very valuable gift. And I think the NRSA has allowed me to, learn these new things that advance me professionally and advance my science.
Thank you, Courtney. We'll go to Lori next.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lori Leibold, and I don't know if Dr. Rubel remembers this, but when I was a PhD student with Lynn, he impressed upon all of us the ability to tell people what your big question was, and I think that that's really, really good advice. So I study, my big question really is how does an infant with age and increasing experience and a host of other factors, how do they learn really to hear? Most of my work investigates the question of how infants and children hear in the presence of background sounds. A lot of what we do involves what people refer to as special populations, hearing loss, intellectual disability, bilingualism, and how those all interplay. But really at the heart of it, I really like thinking about this puzzle of development. I'm an audiologist who went to school, and I worked with, when I went to go do my PhD, I worked with Lynn Werner, who's a developmental psychologist, and I've been a few other places, but now I'm at Boys Town, and I run my lab, but also I manage kind of a program grant, but it's really designed to help early career faculty get established and do, clinical translational work. And so I spend a lot of time talking to people about grant writing, but also just trying to get people to write grants, but also focus on the science, right? Which I think is really the heart of all of it. And then the rest is learning some techniques, but really happy to be here and talk with all of you. And my apologies for being a few minutes late.
Thank you, Lori. Ed, your turn.
Hi. Hi, Lori. Nice to see you again. My interest in hearing really started when I started my own lab. Actually, it started as a graduate student. I was trained, I was a neuroscience trainee before there was a time where neuroscience was a field. So I got my degree, my PhD in psychology. I took all my classes in zoology, and I worked in a biophysics lab as a graduate student. And I had a very, very short postdoc at Irvine, where I made a lot of friends because I didn't get any work done. When I started my own lab at Yale, I decided to work on development of hearing. I had been interested in in development my entire career, such that it was then. And I decided to work on development of hearing, and mostly at that point in the brain, and then the brain leads you back to the ear, and the ear leads you back to pathology and so forth. So I've been working in the field of hearing since I started my own lab in 1971. The reason I'm here is that what has made my career, very frankly, is the students and postdocs and colleagues. Science is a community affair, and it takes people to try and bring that community together. And the first place I could bring that community together was my laboratory. And I always think of my laboratory as my second family. I have 2 kids and 4 grandchildren, and they express many of the things I express, but differently, okay? And I have a lab that has many, many kids and many, many grandchildren, if you will. And they too express kind of what I tried to impart to them. And in both cases, it's with variable penetrance. So your laboratory is like your own family, but a very, very different family. As I say, I'm here because I want to try and facilitate the field of hearing science, whether it be clinical work or fundamental work or anything in between.
Thank you so much, Ed. And you're not only a mentor to your students, you're a mentor to a lot of us in the field. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And
Lori and others, by the way, I'm not Dr. Rubel. My mother didn't name me that. She called me Edwin, but nobody else is allowed to. And so I'm Ed.
So I want to start by asking you each in turn to react to a few things. And while I'm doing that, I'd love for our attendees to think about questions or topics they want to talk about. So by the time we're done with this first round, we'll open up the room and you can jump in, just unmute, and if you want to be on video, do that and ask your question. If there's a big log jam, I'll ask you to raise your hand and call on you. But otherwise, let's keep it informal and moving forward. So I'll start with you, Ed. Wanted to ask you, in watching so many careers evolve over time, have you noticed a difference in people's career trajectories, career impacts, based on whether they apply for and receive one of these NRSA grants?
So thank you, Sumit. But I can't answer that question. And the reason I can't answer that question is because every student in my lab so far has applied for a NRSA, an individual NRSA or something similar, and they've all gotten them. Okay, so all I can follow is their career trajectory. I believe that it's part of the job, that is getting money. If you walk down the street, particularly in our street in Seattle, okay, you're going to see a lot of homeless people. And if you ask each of them to contribute to your research on hearing in chickens, they're probably not going to do it. And so your job is to get money. And so part of the job, not necessarily the first week, is applying for money. And that's just part of the work. And so if I'm going to be a good mentor, I have to facilitate that by asking them what they're interested in and helping them along the way, and having my other colleagues in the lab and colleagues at the University of Washington help them.
Thank you. So I can pick up on that a little bit and go to Katie and Courtney and say, is that what motivated you to write NRSs? And if not, what other things or what things got you to thinking, well, here, let's put all our thoughts on paper and get thrashed? Katie, you want to go first?
Sure. Well, I had lofty goals of writing one on my own, but actually being part of Renee's lab, it was a requirement to write a NRSA grant. It's in her lab manual. As a PhD student, you write a NRSA grant as good practice, right? Because we're all expected to get funding in the future. So why not get some practice in graduate school? And then actually a couple of years ago, Vanderbilt's Hearing and Speech Science PhD program made it a requirement to graduate. So it's part of our comprehensive exam now that you write a NRSA grant. So I didn't really have a choice, but I did enjoy the process quite a bit. I will say the change to making it part of our comms committee was awesome, just because you now have, so we have a standing comprehensive exam committee. And so everybody has the same folks looking at their grants. But the nice thing is you get feedback from 4 scientists, not necessarily in your, small area of research, but you get feedback from scientists partially removed right before you submit it. So for me, I went up for comps last July, and then 2 weeks later, I submitted, the final version of the grant. So I thought it was a great process. Even if it was sort of a requirement, I thought it was very helpful and I learned a lot.
Thank
Katie,
you.
can I jump in? Sumit,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, you said you enjoyed it and so forth. I hate writing grants. I hate it every single time until I'm done with the grant. And then I say, wow, that was really good. Okay, that was really good for me. It forced me to really formalize my thinking on my research.
Okay, Courtney, take your turn and then I'll introduce Dave in a second.
Sure. I guess what Ed just said is a perfect segue for me because I don't know that I enjoyed writing an NRSA, but if someone had asked me, I had read some of Sumit's pre-listed questions for this panel, and one was something to the effect of, why did you write an NRSA? I mean, the glib answer I have is that Sumit told me to. But the real answer is that, you know, as I've gotten further into the PhD process, I've realized that writing informs my thinking, my scientific thinking quite a bit, and vice versa. But the process of writing the NRSA really prepared me, whether or not I got the award, to go into my dissertation and really understand what I wanted to study and what was important and what my research questions were. So for me, it was a very valuable experience to do that.
Thank you, Courtney. Let's change gears for just a second. Thank you for joining us, Dave. You want to take a second to introduce yourself, and then we'll keep moving with the discussion.
Sure. Thank you so much, Sumit. And I apologize for being late. Despite a smartwatch and a smartphone, you can't fix. So I was late. Yeah, I am a professor at the University of South Florida. I'm an audiologist and hearing scientist. In terms of teaching, I've taught lots and lots of different courses over the years, mostly in audiology and some at the undergraduate level and PhD level. These days, I mainly teach a hearing aids course and buy out of most of my other teaching with research funds. In terms of work, I'm super lucky to work with a great group of investigators, and we study various aspects of hearing, hearing enhancement devices, hearing protection devices, perception, electrophysiology, voice quality, perception. So sort of all over the place with the big team.
Thank you, Dave. So maybe my next question is for you and Lori. Maybe we'll start with you, Dave. Your 6-word description of the importance of the NRSA, which we had on the screen till about a second ago, is critical step towards long-term funding success. So would you mind saying a bit about how that getting or writing an NRSA is connected to future grant thinking, grant writing? And then while you're at it, as a reviewer, which both you and Lori are, have reviewed many of these grants at the NIH, what are some critical things that you're looking for as you're looking at one of these proposals? We lost your audio. Yep.
All right, thank you. I'll start with the 6 words: critical step towards long-term funding success. Some people tend to avoid things that they're scared of, and grant writing is certainly something that one might be scared of. And so, you know, if you don't do an NRSA proposal, and you start a faculty position on a traditional academic route, you've got lots of things to pay attention to, research being one, but grant writing being almost secondary to your research. And it's real easy to put off until it becomes a very high pressure situation. And then at that point, you may not have much experience or any at all in actually putting together the components of a grant. So starting early with an NRSA grant just gives you such a head start on people who don't think about grants at the PhD level or at the postdoc level. Sure, there are plenty of other things to do as a PhD student and a postdoc, but getting that experience early on really sets your mind thinking in a way that Courtney just described in terms of how she's thinking about her research, but it puts you in that frame of mind early on, and you never really get back out of it. You're always thinking about your research in a structured way and how you can carry out the research with external funding. And so I think it's critical to get involved early and get your mindset that way. and just stick with it for your career. So that's kind of an expansion on my 6 words. The second part of Sumit's question was about my experience reviewing awards. And in what he had sent us, he asked about critical red flags. So I'm just going to jump to the critical red flags part of it, as opposed to what I'm actually looking for. And there are a lot, and I won't be able to get to all of them because, as you guys know, the NRSA proposals are really complicated proposals. There's so many components to them, and every one of them is evaluated and pretty rigorously. So there are lots of ways that you can sink a reviewer's enthusiasm. But probably, the reviewers are focused more on the training plan and mentorship and a little bit less on the research strategy. And so I think that's an area that's easily overlooked by the mentors and the applicant, but it's where the emphasis is at the review panel. And in terms, I'll just speak maybe in terms of mentorship a bit. Sometimes there is not a great alignment between the mentee and the mentorship team. And that's something that can sink a grant. So not only do you need to have good alignment, but you need to make sure the reviewers know that you have good alignment. So you have to educate them as to why this is a great mentorship team. I think another thing that's just really common in the reviews is that the mentors' roles are not well defined when you have more than one mentor. And so it's super important to make that really clear what each mentor is going to do and how that ties to your training plan. And then occasionally we'll see a grant that isn't prepared all that well, that may have some flaws in the research design or some grantsmanship issues. And we question whether the mentor is actually very involved in the mentorship. And so, when we see a really strong NRSA proposal, we usually anticipate that a mentor was involved in at least proofreading it and making suggestions about the organization and content. So those are some of the things that I think kind of can sink an NRSA, and I'll let Lori expand.
Yeah, thank you, Lori.
Okay, I got to remember both parts of the question, but so I agree completely with Ed. In my experience, grant writing is pain. Like it's, but I think like a lot of areas of growth, right? Emotional growth, science growth, everything. You got to go through it to get to the other side, right? So one piece of advice I always have for people is before I write a grant, even if I think I'm going to write a grant, it ends up being at least a month of just reading. Yeah. And then it's like questioning everything I thought I knew and that I don't know anymore, and all that stuff. And that's why I think it's really important for people to write grants, is because I think otherwise it can be just paralyzing. And when you see people that are really good scientists do this and they push through it, I think it kind of tells you that, it's not just you, it's what the process is. And so I think for me, I don't know that I would have been able to do it without having gone through this process with a mentor. And you guys might be, more resilient than I am, or whatever the case might be. But, there's so much different, you kind of got to learn to take feedback and rejection. And I've had mentors tell me, well, it's too early in your career to stop writing grants, so get working on the next one, right? Like, it's kind of like, it's not like any other area of my life in a way. And so I think it's just such an important thing, because how else would you learn if you don't get to go through the experience? The other thing for me is I've never written a grant, even if other people hate it, where I haven't felt like I've gotten an experiment or two, and not just ones that I think are good, but that have been vetted by people that I respect. And so, like, just from a scientific thinking standpoint, it always has moved the bar forward, even if it's been really painful. Same, I don't have much more about the tips for the actual grant itself. I will say, I've been told a few times, and I have to say that, grant reviewers are human like everybody else. And so you want to make their job as easy as possible. So you don't want to be like too creative in your organization. The other thing I would say is, be careful, right? Like if you submit a grant and it's really sloppy with typos or you know, the thing that comes to my mind, and I don't know if that's for everybody, is I'm like, well, what else is sloppy, right? Like it's your representation, and so just take that extra time. If you aren't great at grammar or something like that, have somebody else take a look. But all of those things, and really the best way to do that is just getting experience with people who have done it before. And yeah, it's also amazing. It's just like this weird cycle of pain and growth. I don't know. I think if you experience that I think that's typical of what I have. Maybe other people do seem to like writing grants, but I'm not one of them.
So Sumit, this is not, I can leave right now because Lori's an academic grandchild of mine. Lynn was a postdoc, and this is just our party line. And I'm still absolutely sure that everybody's going to hate my next grant. Okay, this is, you know, it's so I got to make sure that at least I like it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just want to maybe mention, Dave and I have been on study section together. I haven't been on study section with Lori or you, Ed. I don't know that there is another study section that's as supportive of an applicant as the study section that reviews Fs and, you know, other training grants and Ks and whatnot. So if there is a study section to get your, you know, feet wet in, this is it. There's just no question about it. So if there's no other reason to write an NRSA, this would be one. Right. Would you agree, Dave, Lori?
Absolutely. I've served on a number of different NIH review panels, and the first time I was on the panel reviewing training grants, I immediately noticed the difference in just the community and the ambiance around the review table, and the camaraderie was really, really something. And Sumit's right, people won't knock your feet out from under you. In fact, they try to do just the opposite, which is really, really nice.
Yeah, and I'll add to this, you know, I've been somebody who's been told that it's not always what I say sometimes, but how I say it that's challenging. Is I do think, and I'm not by any means on that extreme end, but I think that vastly the people on these review panels really want we want, you know, I want people to come in and, you know, challenge the things that we do or do good science, right? And when people give feedback, especially if people take the time to be specific about their feedback on grants, sometimes it's really hard to take it, right? But most of the time, you know, the question, if you can get yourself to a point where you're like, is this true or not? You know, if somebody took the time to really give you thoughtful feedback, and you take it, I think that you'll be better off for it. And I agree. I think most people really want other people to be successful in that committee in particular. I'm not sure I would agree with that on all panels, maybe, but that's right, as you mentioned. But yeah, we want more people in the field, especially F grants and things like that, I think.
So what I do is I look at a review, and if it's not glowing, I get really mad, and I start writing my rebuttal, and then I put it away for a week and come back, and I'll find out that was a really helpful review.
Thank you, Ed. So just to validate what we are saying, Katie and Courtney, did you find your reviews to be encouraging, to be helpful, to kind of, you know, help you keep going? Courtney, you
yeah,
can go
I don't.
first this time. Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything too insightful to say beyond what's already been said, but I was actually surprised at the length of some of the comments and the extensiveness of the feedback that I received in a positive way. I mean, it is always hard to read a critique of you and your work, whether it's positive or negative. That is difficult to swallow. But yeah, I remember opening up reviews and reading through them and then just sort of closing it and sitting on it and opening it up again later after Sumit and I both like talked about it. So yeah, I was surprised at the time that the reviewers took to provide feedback, and for the most part it was very helpful. And you know, if I think about the time spent doing that, it's not insignificant, and it was valuable for me.
Katie, anything you want to add?
No, I agree with everything that's been said so far. I guess the only thing I'll add is actually some of the reviews, you know, a reviewer would say like, you know, I don't really understand why you're using this particular measure, or, you know, I don't really understand why you're including this or whatnot. And so it gave me a chance to go back to my committee, and we, you know, reevaluated some things. And I think actually the project's way better afterwards. So I kind of saw it as like a cheat before you hit peer review, like some of those, you know, why did you choose this, you know, before you even start data collection. So
yeah,
it was painful though. I definitely can't, I read the reviews and then you put it away for a week, like Ed said. So
yeah, that's great. So I have to admit, one of my favorite times is the time between getting the reviews of an F and knowing that it's going to be funded, because I know this is so funded, but Courtney doesn't. She's like, oh, this is so horrible. No one's going to give me money. I'm like, oh, well, maybe not. It's really a fun time for me. Anybody, it's open season, have questions, just unmute yourself and ask. If not, I have some other things I can keep going on, so I'll just pause for a second.
Let me just add a couple of things that are related to what others have said. And one is that I think people who are new at doing this underestimate the time it takes getting from your first idea and your first draft of the specific aims page to the final is a very long time. So I think people underestimate it, and there's nothing worse than having to rush.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always a million things to do those last few days, but you really have to map out a timetable, a very realistic timetable. It's not unusual to go through 10 drafts of specific aims page before it's just right. So take the time you need and make sure you have a reasonable timeline, and you have the time to devote to getting the best application possible, because really nowadays we really only have 2 shots at it.
Yeah.
The second thing that I found to be very helpful, a lot of you talked about having your mentors read, and that's absolutely true. But I have found it also very helpful to have others read the application. People who don't know anything about your science can suggest really helpful things, and sometimes better than people who know what you're doing. And then, of course, people who are know your general area, but are a little bit removed from it, their feedback can be invaluable. And what is really helpful is that the reviewer on the study section, unless a miracle occurs, is not likely to be a perfect match for your science. Mm-hmm. So these reviewers who are a little bit, not the expert like your mentor, but a little bit outside of your area is really the match for who your reviewers on the study section will be. And if you can get those reviewers excited and enthusiastic about what you're doing, that's a ticket to success. And so you want to find people in your lab or labs down the hall or in another department to read your proposals. And the more the better. And again, related to time, if you're going to do that, give them a lot of time. Don't ask someone to read your grant 2 days before it's due. No, you got to give them a lot of time. So those are 2 things that I wanted to add that I found to be helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Judy. And anything Judy has to say about grants, you should take very, very seriously. So thank you for sharing that wisdom. All right, comments, questions? Okay, so while
I do have a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead, Holly.
Thank you. This is something that Dave talked about, which was really letting reviewers know why it's a good alignment between you and your mentor. So aside from, being in similar kind of fields of research and have similar interests, in what other ways can it come through that you either are or are not a good fit with your mentor? I guess presumably if you are submitting a grant with your advisor, your PI, right, you probably have pretty kind of similar research interests. So I guess in what other ways does it seem like that would or would not work?
So Holly, take a second, tell us a bit about yourself. PhD student, postdoc, AUD
Oh,
student.
sure. Yeah, sorry. I'm a PhD student at Ohio State. I'm actually working on an F-31 that I'm hoping to submit at some point this year, hopefully in July, but we'll see if it makes it in time. Like Judy said, it takes a long time. So that's kind of where I am in the drafting process right now.
Okay, thank you. So Ed, Lori, Dave, whoever wants to jump in.
I'll jump in. Go on. Somebody else said they were going to jump in.
You go first and I'll go after.
Okay. Well, what you're really talking about, Holly, is choosing a mentor and choosing the right mentor, which is always a difficult thing for a beginning graduate student. In my opinion, the first thing you ask is, do you like the science? It's about the science. You're being trained and trying to become a competent scientist. So it's important to find a mentor in an area that you really like. I mean, you really like. The second thing is, will this person be a good mentor? Not a good friend, not a father or mother figure, okay, but a person that has some experience and a track record as a mentor. And that's a very different job than being your good friend or you got to like each other and you got to work together, but it's about a working relationship, not that person, loving you or you loving that person. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind is, will this person be a good mentor? And to figure that out, you have to figure out their mentoring style, their mentoring experience, like where are their students now? And the third thing that most people don't think about in terms of a mentor is, will they take the time? That is, do they have a track record of taking the time to be a good mentor? And finally, are they fallible? That is, can you present your ideas to them and have them listen? Or is it really about their ideas? Because a good mentor is not a person that's going to tell you what to do. There's a good mentor as a person that's going to help you figure out what you're going to do. And that's the only way you'll grow.
I certainly agree with that. I'll just speak a little bit more to the mechanics of the grant. So the training plan is pretty broad and it has a number of components in it. And the idea is for the applicant at the end of the grant period to be pretty well-rounded in each thing they've identified as it being in the training plan. Sometimes a single mentor is not able to provide adequate training in all of those areas. So for example, one of my weaknesses is statistics. So I have two statisticians that I regularly work with on research projects and grants. When I submit a K or an F grant with a mentee, I bring on one of my statistics experts as a co-mentor. That helps make a more well-rounded training plan. And if anybody who's reviewing it, like Sumit or Lori, knows me, they know I'm not very good at statistics, so they're going to be looking for that person, right? So it's more than just that one mentor. Often there is a team, and particularly if you need a team in order to carry out the training plan.
Thank you, Dave. Lori, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think almost everything I've done has been with other people. I think, I also believe strongly with what Ed said, that the science drives the process, but then the case is, okay, so this is your question. You've got this great idea. Do you have the expertise? But that includes not just you, but you and your mentor. And are they willing to bring on other folks? And the other thing when I've reviewed the F grants is people want to know specifics, right? So if you're like, I'm gonna talk about papers with my mentor. I mean, maybe if everything else is really good, but maybe describe what papers, how you're going to meet, how often you're going to meet. It seems like a lot, but or maybe your mentor has a good colleague and you're going to go visit them for 2 weeks to learn about something else, or, anything you can do to strengthen that plan. And it's okay. So the other thing is it's really obvious when a mentor hasn't read a grant. And to me, that's a really big red flag. And it's unfair in a way to the student, but it's pretty obvious when I've read a grant, I'm like, did so-and-so even read this?
Yeah.
But if they're not going to read the grant, it makes you wonder about everything else about the project, right? So it's the same thing. And so you want to find somebody that is engaged and is going to work on it, and that you've talked about some of those specific issues about how are we going to do this? What journal groups am I going to go to? All those kinds of things. And so when you think you've got a good training plan, beef it up, just do a little bit more. And I think you can be creative too with what that looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Lori.
Yeah,
I'll add-
Sumit,
Go
I
ahead.
need to jump in again because there's something we all forgot to say,
Yeah,
including myself. And that is get other successful training grants that people at your institution or other institutions have written. Okay, when a student of mine says, I'm going to write a NRSA, or when we agree that that person's going to write an NRSA, I say, okay, get Julie's, get Stacy's, get Lynn's is a little old, but get these ones and look over them and look over all the parts of them. And we keep a stock of these, and every good program keeps a stock, or should. And so it wasn't just in my lab, it was, throughout the Bloedel Center when people were doing this, okay? And each program should, and each investigator should keep a stock of these. And then you can see, well, the mentor wrote there that I have a lab meeting every week, and that person has to present their work from that week, okay, and so forth. And those are the things that will convince reviewers that this is a team, not an individual.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. So I'll extend what Dave and Lori and Ed just said in a way that I've seen happen on proposals. So you had mentor, then you had a mentor pair, then you have a mentor team, and then you have mentorship cloud, where there's so many people listed that, you've got everything covered under the sun, but there is no clear mapping of how these mentors will work with you. And the mapping needs to happen at two levels. There has to be an intellectual mapping of the content area that they are experts in, that they'll contribute to your training, but also a practical operational mapping of how, when, where, how many times a year. And without those two pieces, just having a bunch of names on the proposal, it backfires every time. So, all right, any other questions? Okay. I'll ask a question of the three mentors and reviewers, Ed, Lori, and Dave. How do you think through when someone is ready? And typically, what is it in a PhD program? How many years in do you start talking about an NRSA with your students, and how does that process evolve? Dave, you want to start?
Sure. My thinking on that has evolved a little bit because our PhD program now requires, as the qualifying exam, to write and defend an NRSA proposal. And so all of my PhD students, we have 5 right now, all of my PhD students are gearing towards an NRSA. Not all of those get submitted to NIH. Mm-hmm. And I have had one case where it was submitted prior to the actual defense because it was ready. Mm-hmm. Several times we've submitted it well after it was very well revised, and a few times it's just not submitted. Mm-hmm. So I think you're right. You have to figure out when it's ready and when the student is ready. It's certainly an individual thing. They need to have worked on a publication. Hopefully, it'd be great if it's already published, but at least work on a project and the publication of that, so they've got the writing chops to progress towards writing a good, strong proposal. But it really varies from student to student.
Thank you, Dave. Lori, and then Ed.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer other than it's ready when it's ready. Mm-hmm. I think that we're talking about all this and training and everything, but at the end of the day, if the science isn't solid, it's likely not going to get funded. So usually in my lab, depends on the stage, whether it's pre-doc or post-doc, but usually when people have started to develop their own ideas, maybe they've worked on things in the lab, but when you've got some decent ideas and some pilot data and you're able to kind of do that
Mhm.
independently, that's when people are ready. So I don't know, for postdocs, it usually takes people a year-ish, but some people come in and they hit the ground running, and other people, I think if they're switching areas or something, it just kind of takes longer. And so yeah, not a great answer, but it's ready when the science is ready, and some people need more time than others, and that's okay.
And
Well, for me, it's quite different with a PhD student and a postdoc. Okay, let's start with a postdoc. That's easy. Some people have written an NRSA before they've even come to my lab, like Dan Sains. Okay, because we had already discussed what he was going to do. He knew that he was going. We both knew what he was going to do before he came. He decided to come to my lab. We started on a postdoc application 6 months before he came, and it was funded. Other people are coming from a different field. Dan came from already having experience in auditory neuroscience. Other people come from a different field, and it may take them 6 months to a year to apply, but they already know how to do science. They need to learn a lot about the auditory system. I need to be sure that they can write with, I find that out in the first draft of the specific aims, of course, and so forth, and we work through it. But I would expect that almost every postdoc that's ever joined my lab has an NRSA in by the time they're there for a year, okay? The graduate students, as soon as a person chooses, and we had a rotation system for most of my career, but as soon as they kind of committed to to my lab, they were involved in a project, of course, at the very beginning, maybe during a rotation. And a good example is Julie Harris, who started out with, if you look at the zebrafish work, she was the first author on our first zebrafish paper with Dave Rabel and myself. She did that whole project virtually on a postdoc, and on a rotation, but she had a lot of help, okay? And I said, okay, it's time to write an application. And she said, I really don't want to be a hair cell biologist. I want to be a neuroscientist. And over the next 6 months, she wrote an application to study genetics of brain development or gene expression during brain development. But I would say by the time a person has been in the lab a year, they've almost always had an application in. But as Judy said, it's taken 6 months, okay? It's not their application. I never think of it as their application, even if they're doing something new for the lab. It's the application. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so Lisa has a question in the chat. I'm going to modify it slightly to ask Courtney and Katie to answer it. How did you know that this was the right mechanism for you to apply? What's the process you went through? And have you thought about what's the next grant that you're going to write? And how did you figure out what was that mechanism going to be? Katie, your turn to go first.
Okay. Well, I think the decision to write an F32 was pretty much made for me. That was pretty easy. I had an AUD before starting the PhD program, so that's kind of what the path was. The answer for what's next depends on what's next for me. I'm still about a year away from defending my dissertation, so if I go the postdoc route, then it'll probably be, maybe a K for audiologists. I forget what the number is, maybe a K01. Or, if I go more of a clinical director route, then it might be something else. So TBD on that.
Okay. Courtney?
Yeah, I have a similar answer to Katie, and that is I have an AUD, so I think the F32 was my option. So that made things easier. And similarly, I'm still a couple years out from defending and am starting to collect data now. So I have started thinking about my next grant, but those are very abstract thoughts at this point.
Okay. Well, so I'll just say the NIH has a website that is sort of a decision tree that you can go in and punch in where you are in your career and what you want to do. And it kind of lands you in a zone that tells you what your options are. But there's this other resource called a program officer. And what I'd like to do now is turn to the mentors and reviewers here and get their thoughts on how they have encouraged their trainees to collaborate with program officer, get information, interact with program officers. This one, Lori, do you mind starting?
Yeah, and I will say there's variability in program officers too. And I think they're just such a great resource. And if you're lucky, you'll get somebody who's just really straightforward with you. And the nice thing is that they're present in the room when your grant gets discussed, so they can give you a lot of information. But especially for people starting out, I think it's a great idea to send them your aims ahead of time. Make sure that it's kind of in line with what types of grants they want to receive, or, and again, I think my big advice there is be respectful of their time. And if they give you feedback that's hard to hear and you want them to keep giving you feedback in the future, it's, I think, again, their job is to try to help people and clarify, and they again have a mission within their portfolio to, NIDCD has a strong mission to support early career folks. And so that's what they want to do. And, but yeah, I'd encourage you for sure to reach out and meet. And I know sometimes, or they're often, program officers come to AAS or other meetings. And if you haven't met your program officer, definitely introduce yourself and reach out and be respectful and listen. I mean, I think those are the main things, but I've been really lucky. I've had really great program officers who've been able to give really clear feedback. So I know what to do next.
Right. Ed, you want to go next?
Yeah, I do. This is a favorite topic of mine, actually. And if we have time, I have a funny little story to start with. Yeah. Okay, so when I first was in the field, I had 2 graduate students. Many of you maybe haven't heard of Tom Parks, who ended up as a vice president of research at University of Utah, but had a very good research career. Before that, and all of you know who Brenda Riles is. And so we went to ARO. It was, I think, the 2nd year of ARO. And my program officer was a woman named Erlene Elkins, who is, Judy knew her very well, and I did too. I said to Erlene, could you have dinner with my students and I at ARO? And she said, sure. She knew me by that time. And so Tom and Brenda and I had dinner with Erlene. And the reason I gave was I wanted them to know who was responsible for, if you will, pitching our grant and advising us on our first grant at NIH. And that morphed into a Rubalab dinner at ARO, which most people know about. That's on the order of 50 people. But in fact, along came various rules, and the people from NIH weren't allowed to come anymore because it was a private dinner. Okay, but I would go on with what Lori said. Is that this is really important, and the people at NIH are unlike the other institutes, or the bigger institutes, if you will. They are wonderful. They will talk to you anytime. They will give you really frank advice if you have the right one. They have different styles. Nancy Freeman goes by the rules, strictly by the rules, and other program officers are more flexible. Okay, but Nancy is a wonderful program officer that will help you every step of the way and so forth. And I would say, get to know these people. If you get to know one and it changes, they know the other ones. And the NIDCD is really all about the investigators. So just to give you one other example, I have never written a clinical grant in my life. I'm not a clinician. I went into science in order that because I wanted to create knowledge, and I'm now in the process of writing a phase 2 clinical trial. And the people, Kelly King and other people at NIH, know who I am, and they're incredibly helpful and incredibly supportive. And we will get this grant, okay, and it'll be because of them. A little bit because of me, but mostly and our team. Clinical research is a team operation, and particularly pharmacological research. But it would be because of Trin Lee and Kelly King and the other people. And in fact, the people I know there very well, like Deb Tucci and Lisa Cunningham, have to recuse themselves, of course, totally from the grant because they were people in my lab. Okay, and so these people are wonderful, okay? They really are. And you should get to know them early and well in your career. They won't go out to dinner with you alone, okay? Unless they're the director.
Dave, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just briefly, everything that Lori and Ed have said is spot on. But in that time period when Sumit is giddy and Courtney is nervous, it's a great time for nervous Courtney to contact her program officer and ask about her summary statement and what her next steps should be. And often the program officer will give you some advice that's really, really helpful. Like just the reaching out might trigger them to say, you know, you were right on the cusp of funding. Sumit's a little prematurely giddy. And we're not sure if it'll be funded, but if you can write a letter talking about the weaknesses that were cited and how you can overcome them, how they're not going to be showstoppers for your proposal, that letter may go to council and help you get funded. You can't really get that invitation without talking to your program officer. So it's really important.
Thank you. That's
and don't do it until you get the summary statement, because they'll just tell you, wait till you get the summary statement.
That's absolutely right. So, this is all great advice. I'll just also say that this time when you're writing an F or a K award is probably the lowest stakes time to start a relationship with your program officer. And this is the time to do it. And these relationships will last your career sometimes. And I give one example from this group. Amy Donahue, who has retired from the NIH, became a partner with Judy Dubno in launching this affordability and accessibility work that NIH has gotten into. So these things emerge and evolve and then become a force of their own. So take these relationships seriously, cultivate them, nurture them, and they'll be useful. Okay, other questions? Okay, so I will ask a question of the two trainees. In the process of writing the proposal, what were like operational techniques that you used to overcome the enormity of the task in front of you? Did you have set writing times? What kinds of things did you use to get to the finish line?
Courtney, do you want to start this one?
Sure. Yeah, I think I have two practical pieces of advice. One is this worked for me. It might not work for everybody. I finally decided to listen to multiple mentors who said writing every day is really a good thing. And I would get up early. I'm a morning person, so like 5:30 or 6 a.m. when it was quiet, and write for an hour. I would time myself every morning. That occurred in the months where I was like starting to think about the grant and getting early drafts down. And then that also proved very helpful as the deadline approached, because that was my dedicated time that no matter what else I had going on that day, that was my dedicated time to write and make edits and so forth. And my other practical piece of advice is I am a type A person, and I use a task management system called Asana. I think you can create a free account for one user, and that I use to organize all my daily tasks, but it was especially helpful for organizing the NRSA because there are so many different components to it, the training plan, lots of different documents that you have to put together in addition to your research and your training plan. And so that allowed me to just keep track of what I was doing, what I had left, and the status of all of these things, because there are a lot of different documents. And I said I had two pieces of advice. The third is there are a lot of different documents, and some of them you can do early. Like you can get a solid draft of those done even when your science is still being worked out and your training plan is still being worked out. So taking breaks to work on those documents and just getting them fleshed out as early as possible, I think is a good thing, because then you have one less thing on your plate to worry about as you think about the bigger, more important pieces.
Katie?
Yeah, I second everything that Courtney said. I didn't have anything too fancy. Vanderbilt gave us sort of a stock spreadsheet with all the documents listed. And so I had my running tally of like what I had done versus what was still left to be done. And similarly, so I submitted last August 8th deadline, and I think I was thinking seriously about writing the grant maybe in April. So I would like get up and write in the morning, and then I use the afternoon to edit what I had written the day before. So there was time to sort of like put it away and think about it, and then come back and sort of edit what I had like word vomited onto the page the day before, and sort of cleaned it up. And so I went through this like process for about 3 months of, that's pretty much my main project, was writing this grant. Don't have too much advice other than start as early as possible, because actually the first grant I wrote, it was nothing like the finished product. And I think it was Judy who said like 10 drafts of the specific aims. I think I had like 30 or 40. So you can't start early enough.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll pause.
Sumit, you also asked, when do you start thinking about your renewal or your next grant? And I can tell you when I do. Okay, having renewed, I had one grant that lasted 40 years. I start thinking about the next grant the day I get an award notice of one grant. I need to know what I'm going to have in my pocket in 5 years or 4 years, as the case may be. And so I'm already thinking about that, right? And you can't be thinking about it too long, because, different people have different styles. My style was very much like Lori's, in the sense that I start reading voraciously, not knowing what the hell I'm going to do, and read and read and read. I know the subject, but I don't know enough about where I'm going, and eventually 2 or 3 months before the grant is due, it all comes together in my mind by magic. And when that stops happening, I stop writing grants.
Yeah. All right, this is great. Again, we'll pause for a second, see if anyone has a question. If not, I have another one ready, but let's make sure. Okay, now to the mentors and reviewers, Dave, Lori, Ed. One of the tricky situations, which some may face as a student, some may face as a new faculty or new investigator, is to get that first F when you don't have the history of mentoring a lot of PhD students or postdocs yet. How does one think about that situation? What can you do to include in your proposal that overcomes that hurdle? Dave, you want to start first?
Sure. You want to play up any strengths that are relevant. So suppose you've never had an F, but you have graduated 3 or 4 PhD students or 2 or 3 PhD students, then you've shown successful training, especially if those students have gone on to do things that you're willing to put into the grant and help bolster the grant. So that track record can be really helpful and give the reviewers some assurance that you've got the chops to be a mentor on an F proposal. Sometimes you may want to bring in another team member who is more senior and has more experience with Fs. And I certainly see that when I'm reviewing grants, and that makes a reviewer feel a lot more confident that this training plan we're reading can be carried out and can be successful.
Awesome. Ed, do you want to go next? We'll give Lori the last word on this one.
I don't really have much to offer in this case because I started so early, okay, that the rules and guidelines and so forth were very, very different then. And by the time, I'd had a few students and we're doing this and it was regular, I already, people could look back. And also I think a lot of what happened over the time was the other parts of the grant, okay, beyond the science became more and more important. It was, what I used to say when people ask me, how do I train postdocs? I say, well, they come into the lab, they get into their work and they don't go home for 4 years. And that's being a postdoc. Okay, well, there are lots of other things that are required now, and Dave and Lori know much more about that.
All right, your turn, Lori.
Yeah, I'm losing my voice. I think what Dave said was great. I know on my first F grant, maybe my first two, there was a co-mentor. But in part that worked for me because I tend to work pretty closely with a couple colleagues on everything anyway. And so you got to be a little careful because in our case, we already met weekly and had grants together, so that worked. But consultants, you can definitely add a consultant. You could write in training like the mentor's going to take training. There's some mentoring courses, but I would just look and you don't want to do anything artificial or that makes them wonder like, how would this really work? But adding consultants or even somebody who agrees to read your paper, anything you can doesn't hurt. And as a mentor, if you're asked to mentor, those are kind of solutions that I think just alleviate any concerns a reviewer might have. And I agree, though. I think at some point people are variable in how much they are critical of people, right? Because how else are you going to mentor if you don't mentor? But but anything you can do to kind of address that as a concern and head it off, and even just explicitly say like, given that I'm, bring up the criticism before they can, then you've kind of addressed it too. So.
No, thank you. That last point, you have to remember everyone who's reviewing your grant probably had an F themselves and had mentored Fs, probably know the environment of your institution just as well as you do because it's a small field. So if there's anything that is not authentic in the proposal, it's going down pretty quickly. So whatever your solution is, think through it genuinely and come up with something that you can implement that is meaningful. And my experience is the reviewers see it as being authentic attempt to mitigate that one particular roadblock. So, okay, again, we'll pause for a second and we don't have a lot of time left. So I'd love to get some questions from the participants. Okay, so while you're thinking, I have one more question to ask, or maybe I have more, but I'll ask this one. We've talked so much about writing an NRSA, getting an NRSA. What about after you have it? Managing an NRSA, thinking about next steps, etc. And I'd love each of you to comment on it. And maybe we'd start with the two mentees and then go to the mentors and reviewers. So Courtney, you want to start?
Sure. So managing an NRSA is difficult. I think it's a learning experience in and of itself because you've spent so much time developing this idea and this training plan, and then you have to execute it. And that's a different skill set altogether than writing about it. So I guess my practical piece of advice here is to give yourself time in your training plan to do what you need to do to get off the ground. So whether that's coding your experiments or figuring out a new method, make sure that there's a decent chunk of time that you've allotted yourself in the training plan to be able to do that and learn that and get going. Because just like writing an NRSA, I think that getting off the ground can also take longer than you think it will. So that's one piece of advice.
Thanks. Katie?
Words are super true right now. Is I'm about to start data collection, and it's about 2 months past where I thought I would be at this point. I love checklists and calendars. And so like in my training plan, you know, I've written out like month by month, this is what I would be doing in research and then in the training areas that I had written about. And so now that I have it, I have to kind of stick to that. So every month at the end of the month, you know, I keep track of what I actually did. And then I have lofty goals for the next month that I hope I at least get through half of those to try and keep myself honest about how much progress I'm making. And it sort of helped also because if my research is stalled a little bit, I can at least look back and say, well, I haven't just been sitting here doing nothing, you know, these are all the things that I've gotten to be able to do. So I've found that really helpful, especially when, you know, you get stuck on coding something or, you know, a task isn't working like I thought it would. So that's helped me.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just go by the order I see you on my screen. Ed, you're next.
Yeah, I think it's important to remember that these are grants, not contracts. And you have to figure out what's working and what's not working and figure out how to, you know, when to fish and when to cut bait and things like that all the way along the way. And I'm not a good person with calendars or lists or things like that. People have said that I do things with the seat of my pants, okay, but I'm not sure I'm that random. And I'm not sure I let my students be that random, but I think it's important to assess what you're doing in this grant and ask, okay, is this working? How much time do I give it to work? And how do I, you know, my first project was a project on imprinting in Copernicus quail. And that was the first project I did alone. I didn't really have a mentor as a graduate student, okay, until the end, until I started doing physiology. And these Copernicus quail wouldn't follow a block that I had worked, you know, running around in a circle like people studied imprinting. And so I listened to the quail and they were making these peeps. They were making these, you know, peeps, distress calls they were called. And I said, well, maybe I could use those. And I shifted my outcome variable to using those. Actually, several people copied me and published them before me. That was the first time I had been ripped off. But my thought about that person was, gosh, that guy has to copy a little graduate student. Okay, that's too bad. And he disappeared. But I think it's a good example that things may change. DPOEs may not be the best measure. Okay, you might have to use an audiological measure like a PTA or something like that. It's you know, I think that's my answer.
All right, Laurie, you're next.
Yeah, I don't know that I have too much more to add other than I like the idea that it's not a contract. I do know some people who get a grant and they do everything exactly in sequence to what they said. And I've never had a grant like that because something comes out a way I didn't expect. Yeah. And then spend the next while. And to me, that's really fun, right? Like, oh, the data don't look like what I thought. So what does this mean? And so I think that helps because it gives you a little more flexibility and takes some pressure off. I think that managing grants, like the logistics, is really hard and no one teaches you that much about it. So the budget stuff, and F grant budgets are even weirder than regular budgets, I think. But it's like getting experience jumping through those hoops, but learning on a small scale, maybe to manage people in the lab. Or I would encourage everybody to try to keep track of their own budget, even if there's not that many items on it, because you will need to know how to do that later. And you know, it's just all of that. But I think being productive is really important, because that sets the stage for the next grant. And if they're going to give you more money, people want to make sure you've done something with the money that you were given. So I know it's kind of open-ended, but it's a first entry. And honestly, I recall being really confused about all the I still am, about all the F rules and how that works. And tax is really weird here at Boys Town for F grants, but there's a lot of weird rules like that in NIH. And so I think it teaches you to learn to read the manual, the instruction guide, and all those things. So.
Let me add something that I didn't say. Remember, when you get results you didn't expect, that's not bad. Nature's trying to teach you something, okay? And that's the time to listen, okay? Particularly when they're important results that you didn't expect, okay? Listen and try and figure out, why did you get them? That's when we learn something. When we get all the results we expect, we don't learn anything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Dave.
Yeah, we'll build off that spirit. It's cumulative. So, you know, your goal usually in seeking an F grant is to put you on that track for academic and research success in the next grant. And that's the goal of the mechanism as well. So that's NIH's goal for you. Part of that requires productivity and requires publication. So in managing a grant, any grant, you've got to think about your output and how your output is going to help you obtain your larger goals. And if your larger goals include a next grant, then publications are right up there with the top quality output. So you want to just keep your eye on that and have that in your, your timeline. And you can always revise your timeline based on results and other life circumstances, but publication is super important.
Thank you. Just one quick thing, the thing that Ed and Lori mentioned about NIH grants being grants and not contracts, it is such an asset. So utilize it, because right now our lab has a PCORI multi-center trial running. That's a contract. You wanna change a question in the questionnaire, you have to go through a renegotiation and sign redo the contract to get even the smallest changes done. And it's just a different way of thinking about science. It's we could argue whether it's productive or not and whatnot, but this is a gift, and we have to go with where the best science takes us. Okay, we're gonna run.
Try dealing with the FDA.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'd love to do is kind of go backwards, and with our two trainees, just give you 30 seconds to offer some closing thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to Lisa to close us out. Dave, you want to start?
Yeah, I heard when I first jumped on late, I apologize again, about how grant writing can be painful. There are a few of us, I like hot weather too, so I'm just kind of a strange guy, but I love grant writing. I really enjoy it. In fact, I'm somewhat addicted to it. And the process, the planning process, the reading and immersion process, the writing with other people, and I tend to do that, is just really exciting. And it's what I prefer to spend my time doing. And so it doesn't have to be, it's still scary. And I still get that terrible feeling in my stomach when I get my reviews back. But I love the process of putting together a project and putting together a grant.
Thank you, Dave. Lori?
Yeah, I'm going to use a bad sports analogy, but it really is a marathon. I think there will be grants. I think there's grants that I've written that didn't get discussed that were my better grants, and maybe grants that got funded that weren't. But I think as a whole, if you persevere and you're just resilient and you listen to feedback, that I think over time that works. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a perfect system, but it's probably the best we've got. And so it's really hard, right? Like, and it's hard when you're in a tenure track position or this and that, but
Yeah.
I just urge people not to be discouraged, maybe to try things differently, right? Maybe ask people for feedback or ask people for grants, but just urge people not to give up, because I've had lots of grants paid. I've had lots of grants not paid. I'm not going to do the proportion, but I bet you it's higher than most, and especially early on, and sometimes when you're doing new things, it takes a while to figure out how to convince other people. So, I guess I would urge people, let the science drive what you do, but then, just get smarter about writing grants, but don't give up, because it's hard, but it's also wonderful.
Yeah, your turn.
I guess the only thing I would stress is we've talked about a lot of things. We didn't talk about choosing a mentor, but maybe that's already done for most of the people on the call. But what I want to stress is that science is a community affair, and reach out to your colleagues at your institution that know things that you don't know, and at other institutions. And don't try and hide what you're doing. Try and facilitate what you're doing through your colleagues and so forth. Remember, if you have another name on the paper, that's perfectly fine, okay? Particularly if it allows you to do something unique. And all you have to do is reach out. People ask me when I started working with zebrafish, and wasn't that hard? And I said, yeah, I had to walk all the way across the street to Dave Rabel's lab. Okay, and, no, it wasn't hard. Okay, it's easy. And if you look at my career, you'll see there are an enormous number of different people that were colleagues or students. Okay, that doesn't mean we publish papers with an enormous number of authors. We didn't do that. But each thing I do, it seems that there are people around with more expertise in it than I have. So reach out.
Yeah, thank you. Judy, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, but by the way, thank you all for putting this together. This is an amazing group of people with decades and decades of experience. And I wish when I was first starting, I had the opportunity to listen to what you're listening to. It's been great. But there's one thing that hasn't been said that I think would be a good thing to end on. Now, Ed said that he starts to think about his next grant right when he gets his notice of award. And I'd like to say one other thing that everyone should do, and that's celebrate. I think we don't have enough opportunity when you get a paper published or when you get a grant. Just remember to take time to celebrate with your friends and your family and your colleagues, and just enjoy that moment, because they don't come along very often. And when it does, you gotta break out and celebrate.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank
Katie,
you.
your final words.
I add that I did have a good time writing this grant. I may be in the minority, but mostly because it just gave me an excuse to sort of go away and read a bunch of papers that I probably wouldn't have ever read. And then I went out and reached out to some of those authors and just said, hey, what do you think about this? Or is this a dumb idea? And then I started, collaborating with people that our lab had never collaborated with before. So I thought it was a great time. Not all of it ended up going in the grant, but it was just some cool conversations that sort of developed from my time, away, which was convenient because it was during COVID. So it gave me an excuse to read a bunch about things I'd never had a chance to yet.
Thank you. Courtney.
Yeah, I guess I'll just repeat something I said earlier, which is from my time working clinically and in industry before coming back for a PhD, I really learned the lesson that having the opportunity to just sit around all day, not just sit around all day, but sit all day and learn something that you're passionate about and something new that is really a gift because not everybody has that opportunity in their job function. And above anything else, I think the NRSA has given me that opportunity and that freedom to, pursue questions that I'm very passionate about and to pursue training and learning experiences that cater exactly to me, since I'm the one who created them with Sumit and my other mentors. And so, you have to do a dissertation to finish your PhD. You have to do certain things, and why not practice this and get your experiments ready by writing a grant? I mean, why not?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to say thank you to the panelists and then turn it over to Lisa to close us out.
Thanks so much, Sumit. And I want to give a special thanks to Sumit because this was his idea and it's a fantastic idea. And I really, really enjoyed hearing all the conversation today. And we really want to do more of these webinars on different topics. So we're really interested, anyone who is on today or anyone else that you know and interact with, if you have ideas about things that you'd like to see webinars on, please let us know. I put my email in the chat. We're also really interested in building our student and postdoc AAS group or SPAs. We did shamelessly steal from ARO, but gave a twist on that because we think part of the idea of SPAs is to build a community of people who can support each other because this is really hard work. And I won't parrot what others have said today, but just some of the things that really resonated with me is, first of all, know that you can do this. It sounds like pushing a boulder up a mountain when you start, but you all have the capability to do this. It's really, really hard work, but it's worth it. And it will really make you a better scientist because you'll have to put in the dedication to really get there. And so start early, do your homework, similar to graduate school, but this time it's about your ideas, not a topic that someone else has given you or, an assignment that you have. This is your assignment that you're creating. Schedule time to write daily. Seek advice from lots of varied people. Don't just go deeper and deeper into one area, also go broader. Team science is becoming so important in our field, and that's an opportunity for you to learn from people that are completely outside your area, but have, some things that could really help expand. Make sure that you take advice to heart, even if it's really hard to take. So take it to heart, but not personally, and take care of yourself. This is one thing I didn't hear much of today, but take care of yourself. When you're writing, you spend long hours hunched over a desk. And I know from experience that can really wreck your back over the years and decades. So make sure you get outside and exercise because that will also help unleash your creativity if you step away from the desk, especially if you're stuck. Find your tribe and love them a lot. Share your successes with them. Share, your challenges, the things that aren't working out. Reach out. Don't think that you have to know everything before you contact an expert. So I think those are some of the words that really resonated a lot with me, and I think are truisms for everyone who's writing a grant. So thank you for being here today. A huge thanks to all of our mentors. These people, and Judy, thank you, and Don for being on the call. You all have done so much for this field. And mentoring, I can tell why you love mentoring because you've had great mentors in the past and you know the power of that and you're passing that on to the new generation. So I thank you so much for that. And Katie and Courtney, thanks for sharing your words of wisdom and what worked for you. And I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend coming up and that you'll look for future webinars. We have some that are advertised on the homepage of AAS. There's Foundations for Auditory Research that Adam Boson at Boys Town and several others, including Lori, generously provided recordings that are part of another training grant. And so we are so happy that they were willing to share those with the AAS community so that everyone can take advantage of them. They're free of charge, and we hope you'll look into those and sign up. And please give us your ideas for other webinars in the future.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, everybody. Now go write your 37th version of the specific aims page. See ya.